So what I'm going to try and do here is provide a very quick and dirty history of the United Kingdom up to about 1800. And I'm going to focus on a couple of major trends that are significant in British history and that will build into the things that we're studying in this Brit Lit II course. I could talk extensively about English history, so I'm going to try, or British history, so I'm going to try and keep this short. So the first people that we know a lot about, so the place I'm going to start with this is who are the British? What does this term mean? So the first people that we know of, or that we know a lot about, who occupied the British Isles were the Celts, who were Iron Age sort of tribes people. They were initially sort of conquered by the Romans, but the Romans didn't displace them. They just sort of required taxes and things like this. So like about 405, the Romans leave Britain because Rome is in the process of being destroyed. So they pull their garrisons out of this northern colony. And then by about 500, 520, there's a new wave of invaders, primarily the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, who are coming from Denmark and from northern Germany. These are Germanic tribespeople, and they come in and they displace the Celts from most of England itself. So the Germanics come in, these Germanic tribes come in, and push the Celts out. The Celts flee to Wales, Cornwall, Scotland, and Ireland. And these today continue to be predominantly, or culturally, the origin of these areas remains Celtic, whereas the cultural origins of England are primarily Germanic. And it's actually from the invading tribe, the Angles, that we get the term England, land of the Angles. So that happens. The next sort of wave of invaders is the Vikings, so Danes, Norwegians, and Swedes, who start coming in and raiding and sort of colonizing in the 8th and 9th centuries, 9th and 10th centuries, large portions of sort of northern England, of Scotland, and of Ireland are controlled by Vikings who have come and settled there. And there's a series of wars to sort of drive them out. But then the next major invasion, and actually the last major invasion of Great Britain, was by the Normans. So the Normans were from northern France. They were descendants of Viking raiders who had settled in northern France, and they established themselves as a French aristocracy, and they conquered England in 1066 when a guy named William the Conqueror won the Battle of Hastings and spread Norman political authority across most of England. It took them longer, so they conquered England fairly quickly once they sort of won the initial battle at Hastings. It took them longer to conquer the Welsh. There was a series of invasions where they invaded Scotland and sort of went back and forth on Norman English or Anglo-Norman control of Scotland. Same thing with Ireland, series of invasions, series of wars, and sort of back and forth on Anglo-Norman control of Ireland as well. So this is the basic sort of ethnic makeup of the English. There are England, English culture, the English people have a sort of Germanic base from the Angles and the Saxons. This gets layered, especially in northern England, with some further Scandinavian influences. But then it gets a healthy dose of French and a healthy dose of sort of a mediated Scandinavian mediated through French culture with the Norman invasion. So over time, the two sort of cultures meld together, and we get the contemporary English. Again, Wales, Scotland, Cornwall, and Ireland remain Celtic, but obviously they're getting sort of descendants of Anglo-Saxons coming in with English invasions, and they're getting Normans coming in with English invasions. So you have a certain amount of cultural mixing that goes on, and then as Scottish people, Irish people, and Welsh people sort of come to England, especially northern England later on in the Victorian era, they bring elements of Celtic culture. So, like, for instance, the city of Liverpool is probably, which is in England, is now probably more Celtic than it is English because of the number of Irish immigrants, Welsh immigrants, and Scottish immigrants who came seeking jobs there in the 19th century. So that's the sort of ethnic and linguistic makeup of the British Isles, is Celtic, Germanic, and French predominantly, sort of melded together, which eventually produces modern English, the modern English language and modern English people, modern British people. So a couple of big things, a couple of big trends and sort of important changes to track over the history of Great Britain. One is that Britain develops a long heritage of democracy, and this starts with not terribly democratic roots, actually, in 1215, when a council of barons forces King John to sign the Magna Carta, which gives a certain number of rights to this council of barons. And this becomes sort of the foundation of Parliament, which is kind of like the English Congress. This Council of Barons is a sort of predecessor of what's known as the House of Lords, which is the upper house of British Parliament. The lower house is the House of Commons. The House of Commons is elected, the House of Lords is hereditary. The aristocracy of certain rank gets seats in the House of Lords. So 1215 we have Magna Carta. There are a series of peasant revolts in the Middle Ages, the most significant being 1381. But then really once we get to the 1600s, this is where sort of pushes for democracy, pushes for representation, and pushes for sort of expanding political authority really come into their own. And this ultimately leads to the English Civil War, which starts in 1642, which pits parliamentarians, people who support Parliament, especially the House of Commons, against monarchists or royalists, people who support King Charles I. And eventually, in 1649, Charles I is actually executed by order of Parliament. And so, in a Republican dream that is not really fulfilled, Parliament sort of establishes itself as ruler of Great Britain, but then Oliver Cromwell is named dictator for life, and so that sort of ruins the potential for a democratic Renaissance era England. This goes on. In 1660, we have the restoration of the monarchy and the end of this sort of Republican experiment. But this is a very different kind of monarchy. This is a monarchy that is answerable to Parliament, as opposed to something like the French monarchy, which is an absolute monarchy, where the King of France is the only political authority that matters. In England, the monarch has to work with Parliament to run the country. And this is still true today, although today the monarch has less of a sort of political role and more of a sort of state role. So, I mean, we have this great sort of trend of democracy rising throughout this era. Britain has a free press, which means that there's a sort of public sphere, a written public sphere, in which people can debate political issues, philosophical, scientific, religious, literary, aesthetic ideas, and so on and so on. And so this is sort of a cornerstone of securing British liberty. And then we get to the Romantic era, the Regency period, the Age of Revolution. And as you know, if you watch the overview of the Romantic era, this is a period when people are pushing for increased rights and freedoms and things like this. So that's one of the major trends that we want to be aware of. Another major trend is that Britain tends to be at the cutting edge of capitalism, starting from about the mid-1500s. So the Spanish and the Portuguese and people like this have sort of well-established empires when Britain starts creating its empire, but partially because it's an island, Britain is very, very good at establishing an overseas empire. So the empire itself starts in about 1608 or so. There's experiments earlier on where Britain tries to establish colonies in the 1590s and stuff, but really some of the first successful colonies were the early 1600s. Britain set up colonies in North America, and then slightly later on, in what's called the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War in the U.S., Britain basically establishes its control because it defeats the French, it defeats the Spanish, and so British imperial power becomes strongly established. They get Canada, they get sort of full control over India, they get a large number of islands in the Caribbean, and so this empire building is continuously fueled by rising capitalism. So what do I mean by capitalism? Capitalism is a political economic system that is based on competition over resources. So Britain wanted colonies primarily for two reasons. One is to create markets for British goods to be sold to, and the other is to get raw materials to bring into Britain itself. This is why colonization happens, principally. There's also motives, so there's also motives about finding gold, there's also motives about spreading Christianity, and so on and so on. But the main two reasons that drive colonization are the attempt to find new people to sell stuff to or to make buy your stuff, and the desire to get raw materials so that you can make more stuff to sell to colonized peoples. So this is super important, both for its imperial implications and for capitalism, because as we'll see, especially in the Victorian era, capitalism is a major, major, major force that shapes British social identity. So I'll leave off this video here, but those are two of the sort of big trends that we want to be aware of going into 19th century British history and culture.